The sound I made wasn't human. It was a high, sharp, descending shriek. C-H-R-R, C-H-R-R, cree-A-R, the call of a red-tailed hawk circling for prey. It echoed off the lockers, cutting through the low murmur of students shuffling between classes. A few kids stared, their faces a familiar mix of confusion and annoyance. Someone snickered. I didn't care. I was just answering the real hawk I'd heard through the high, open windows of the gymnasium, a faint cry that no one else had even registered. To me, it was a conversation. To them, it was just another reason I was the weird girl. My world has always been tuned to a different frequency. While others hear traffic, I hear the staccato chirps of house sparrows arguing in the eaves of the supermarket. While they hear the wind, I hear the soft, mournful coo-oo-oo-coo-coo of a mourning dove perched on a telephone wire. My father taught me my first call, the barred owls. Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all? We'd practice in the backyard as dusk settled, our voices weaving together in the twilight. After he was gone, the calls were all I had left of him. They became more than a hobby. They were my language, my connection to a world that made more sense than the one inside these beige-bricked school walls. This is why I was sitting in Ms. Albright's office again, the scent of lavender potpourri and stale coffee thick in the air. Her office was a shrine to normalcy, the walls plastered with posters of smiling, diverse teens engaged in, quote, team-building exercises. One poster, right above her head, read, "Find your flock and fly together." The irony was suffocating. "Elara," she began, folding her hands on her pristine desk. She never used my name unless she was about to deliver a verdict. "We've spoken about this. The vocalizations." I stared at the pen holder on her desk, shaped like a miniature Grecian column. I imagined a tiny northern saw-whet owl nesting inside it. Its call is a monotonous, whistled toot-toot-toot. "It's a disruptive hyperfixation," she continued, her voice smooth and practiced, the same tone she probably used for kids caught smoking or skipping class. "Your teachers are concerned. It's impacting your ability to socially integrate. We want to help you channel this energy into something more constructive. Have you considered the debate club, or perhaps the school newspaper?" I traced the grain of the wooden chair with my finger. The debate club was a cacophony of squawking voices, none of which I cared to imitate. "I like birds," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Ms. Albright sighed, a soft, deflating sound like a punctured tire. "Everyone likes birds, Elara. They put them on calendars, but they don't screech in the hallways. We have a plan I'd like you to try. For the next 2 weeks, we're going to set a goal. No bird calls on school property. We'll check in daily. Think of it as a behavioral reset." She was trying to cure me. They wanted to unplug me from my world and force me to listen to theirs, a dull, flat monotone of conformity. I nodded, because nodding was easier than arguing. Nodding got me out of her office faster. As I walked out, my eyes scanned the cluttered community bulletin board in the main corridor. Tucked between a flyer for a car wash and an ad for guitar lessons was a new poster, stark and official. "Missing," the top read in bold black letters. It was a picture of a man with a kind, weathered face, smiling from beneath a baseball cap. His name was Arthur Finch. Last seen 3 days ago near the Black Creek trailhead, on the edge of the state forest. My heart gave a little flutter. I knew that trail. I knew the birds there. I knew the sharp whistle of the northern cardinal that nested near the first creek crossing, and the chattering alarm call of the Carolina wren that lived in the dense rhododendron thicket a mile in. The thought vanished as the bell shrieked, a harsh, unnatural sound that wasn't like any bird at all. The 2 weeks of my behavioral reset began with silence. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket I had to wrap around myself. Walking through the crowded hallways felt like moving underwater. The usual symphony I lived in, the squeak of a sneaker sole mimicking a chickadee's phoebe, the slam of a locker like a raven's sharp caw, was gone. I was forcing myself to hear what everyone else heard, a meaningless, chaotic noise. The first day was torture. During third period history, a blue jay shrieked its alarm call from the oak tree just outside the window, a loud, jeering "J-J-J." It was probably yelling at a cat. My tongue burned with the need to answer, to let it know I heard the warning. I had to clench my fists under the desk, my knuckles white, just to keep the sound locked in my throat. Every day I had to check in with Ms. Albright. I'd stand in her doorway, she'd look up from her paperwork and ask, "Any incidents today, Alara?" I'd shake my head, and she'd give me a tight, approving smile. "Excellent. See? Progress." It didn't feel like progress. It felt like a piece of me was being amputated. My dad's voice, the memory of his laugh as we practiced the owl calls, felt further away than ever. It's a strange thing, being told that the core of who you are is a problem to be solved. If you've ever had to hide the one thing that makes you feel alive, you know what I'm talking about. It's a lonely path to walk. If this story resonates with you, maybe hit that like button and subscribe so you can see where this path leads. My focus kept drifting back to the missing man, Arthur Finch. The name echoed in my head, a gentle, persistent call. A finch, a small, seed-eating songbird. It felt like a sign. The missing poster was still up, but it was starting to look dog-eared. The news reports on my phone were getting shorter, buried under other headlines. They mentioned another cold front moving in. 3 days had become 5, then a week. A week is a long time to be lost in the woods, even for an experienced hiker. He was out there, a vulnerable man in the vast quiet of the forest, and I was in here, trapped in a different kind of silence. The school, with Ms. Albright as its mouthpiece, was trying to make me normal. But the thought of Mr. Finch, lost somewhere near the Black Creek Trail, felt more real and urgent than any team-building exercise. The forest was calling, and I was starting to realize that some calls you just have to answer. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. It was the 10th day of my sentence of silence. I was in the library during my study period, hiding in the nonfiction stacks where no one ever went. The silence in here was different. It was a dusty, respectful quiet, not the strained, artificial quiet I was forcing on myself. I pulled the book from my backpack. It wasn't a library book. It was my father's old field guide. The cover was soft with wear, the spine held together with electrical tape. Inside, the margins were filled with his familiar, spiky handwriting, notes on where he'd seen a particular warbler, the date he'd finally perfected the call of a pileated woodpecker. I ran my thumb over a sketch he'd made of a white-throated sparrow. I could almost hear his voice explaining its song, the clear, sweet whistle of, "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada." His notes were my most sacred text. They were proof that he had existed, that we had existed. Just then, through the thick library window, I saw one, a little white-throated sparrow, its bright white throat patch flashing as it hopped on the lawn. It tilted its head back and sang. The sound was faint, muted by the glass, but I heard it clear as day. "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada." It was too much. The need was a physical ache in my chest. I looked around. The aisle was empty. I ducked my head down, cupped my hand over my mouth to muffle the sound, and let out the softest, most delicate whistle, a perfect echo of the sparrow's song. It was a single, stolen drop of water in a desert of silence. A wave of pure relief washed over me. For a second, I felt whole. "There you are." The voice cut through my relief like a shard of glass. It was Mr. Harrison, the history teacher, peering around the end of the bookshelf. His eyes weren't curious. They were accusatory. They flicked from my face to the book in my hands. He didn't say another word, just gestured with his head toward the library exit. I had been caught. Ms. Albright's office smelled the same, but the atmosphere had curdled. She wasn't sitting behind her desk this time. She was standing in the middle of the room, arms crossed, her "Find Your Flock" poster mocking me from the wall behind her. Mr. Harrison stood near the door like a guard. "I am so disappointed, Alara," she said. Her voice had lost all its practiced smoothness. It was hard and cold. We had an agreement. We created a plan to help you. It was just a whistle, I mumbled, clutching my dad's book to my chest. It felt like a shield. It was a violation of the plan, she snapped. A plan designed for your own well-being. And Mr. Harrison tells me you were poring over this. She held out her hand. May I see the book, please? It wasn't a question. My blood ran cold. No, I said, my voice shaking. It was my dad's. I see. Her eyes were like chips of flint. She took a step closer. Ilara, this hyperfixation is clearly centered around this book. It's an unhealthy attachment. It's holding you back from integrating, from moving on. I'm going to have to confiscate it. No, the word ripped out of me, raw and loud. I hugged the book tighter. Panic was clawing up my throat. You can't. It's mine. She didn't try to reason with me again. She simply walked back to her desk, picked up her phone, and pressed a button. Please send security to the guidance office. The finality in her voice was absolute. She wasn't trying to help me anymore. She was trying to break me. When the uniformed security guard arrived, a big man I'd only ever seen dealing with fights, my body went numb. I didn't fight as he gently but firmly pried my fingers, one by one, off the cover of my father's book. I just watched, hollowed out, as he handed the worn, taped-up field guide to Ms. Albright. She placed it in her top desk drawer and locked it. The click of the lock was the loudest sound I had ever heard. She had taken him. She had taken the last piece of my father and locked him in a drawer. As I stood there, stripped of my history, my language, and my last connection to him, something inside me didn't break. It hardened. The grief and the shock calcified into a cold, clear certainty. This wasn't a school. It was a cage. And Ms. Albright wasn't a guide. She was a zookeeper. They could have my silence. They could have my dad's book. They couldn't have me. My decision was no longer a vague feeling. It was a command. I would go to Black Creek Trail. I would find Arthur Finch. Not just for him, but for me. It was the only way to get my father back. I walked out of the guidance office in a daze. I didn't go to my next class. No one stopped me. I felt invisible, a ghost haunting the hallways I was no longer a part of. The shriek of the bell signaling the end of the period was just a sound, meaningless and distant. I pushed open the heavy front doors of the school and walked out into the pale afternoon light, the cool air doing nothing to clear the fog in my head. I just kept walking. My feet carried me down sidewalks, past houses with manicured lawns and barking dogs I didn't bother to identify. The world was flat, two-dimensional. All I could see was the image of that drawer sliding shut. All I could hear was the click of the lock. They hadn't just taken a book. They had stolen my father's handwriting. They had stolen our conversations in the dusk. They had stolen the only proof I had that my language was real, that it was shared, that it was born from love. Stolen. The word solidified in my mind. Ms. Albright had used the word confiscate, a sterile, clinical term to mask the truth. But it was theft. It was my property. And when something is stolen, you go to the police. The thought was a tiny flicker of hope in the vast, cold emptiness inside me. There were rules for this. There were people whose job it was to make things right. The police station was a low, brick building that looked more like a bunker than a place for public service. Inside, it smelled of cleaning solution and burnt coffee, a scent somehow more desolate than Ms. Albright's office. A thick pane of plexiglass separated the waiting area from a woman sitting at a high desk. She looked up from her computer, her expression utterly neutral. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice as flat as the linoleum floor. I stepped forward, my hands trembling slightly. I need to report a theft." She slid a form and a pen through the slot at the bottom of the glass. "Fill this out." I stared at the boxes. Name, address, date of theft, description of stolen item. How could I describe it? My father's soul, bound in cardboard and held together with tape. I picked up the pen, but my hand was shaking too much. "An officer can take your statement," the woman said, sighing, and gestured to a row of hard plastic chairs. I sat and waited. After a few minutes, a man in a crisp uniform came out. He wasn't old, but his face was tired. He led me to a small, windowless room with a metal table and 2 chairs. "Okay," he said, sitting down opposite me. "What's going on?" "Something was stolen from me today," I said, my voice small, "at school." "Okay, what was it?" "A book. It was a field guide for birds. It belonged to my father." He nodded slowly, his pen poised over a notepad. "And who took it?" "My guidance counselor, Ms. Albright." The officer's pen stopped moving. He looked up at me, and his expression shifted. The professional interest vanished, replaced by a weary sort of pity. "She took it from you? Or she confiscated it?" "She stole it?" I insisted, my voice rising with a tremor of desperation. "It's mine. It was my dad's. She locked it in her desk. I want to press charges." He let out a long, slow breath. "Look, kid," he said, his tone turning patronizing, the kind of voice people use when they think you're being dramatic. "We don't get involved in school discipline. If a teacher takes something from you during class or on school property, that's not a police matter. It's between you, the school, and your parents." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through my numbness. "But it's mine. It doesn't belong to the school. She had no right." "Did you break a school rule?" he asked, his eyes unwavering. I whistled. The absurdity of it hit me full force. "Right," he said, closing his notepad. "So you broke a rule, and there was a consequence. That's how it works. You can't call the police every time you think your teacher is being unfair." He stood up. "My advice? Go home. Talk to your parents. Work it out with the school. You'll probably get your book back at the end of the year if you follow the rules." He was already walking me to the door, his hand lightly on my back, ushering me out. He was dismissing me. This system, this formal, powerful system of law and order, saw me as a nuisance. My pain was just a disciplinary issue. My father's book was just a book. My fear was just teenage drama. I stood on the steps of the police station, the door clicking shut behind me. I had never felt so utterly, terrifyingly alone. I had appealed to the highest authority I could think of, and they had patted me on the head and sent me away. There was no one was coming to help. No one was going to get him back for me. The frustration was a hot lump in my throat. They had all the power, and I had none. That's when I understood. Waiting for someone else to give me permission, to validate me, to save me, that was the real cage. The school, Ms. Albright, this tired police officer, they were all part of the same thing. A world that didn't speak my language and had no interest in learning. Fine. I would stop trying to make them listen. I looked in the direction of the setting sun, toward the deep green line of the state forest on the horizon. Arthur Finch was out there, and the birds were out there. My father's book was locked in a drawer, but his lessons were still in my head. The police wouldn't help me, and the school wanted to erase me. I would have to be my own authority. I would have to be my own rescuer. Home was supposed to be the one place their rules didn't apply. It was my nest, the hollow in the tree where I was safe. But when I pushed open my front door, the feeling was gone. The house was quiet, but it was a heavy, listening quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I walked past the living room, where my mom was on the phone. Her back was to me, but I could see the tense line of her shoulders. I heard her say my name, followed by the words, deeply concerned, and unhealthy fixation. My blood went cold. I froze in the hallway, hidden from her view. I knew who was on the other end of that line, Ms. Albright. She hadn't been satisfied with taking my father's book. She hadn't been satisfied with locking him in a drawer. Now she was reaching into my home, poisoning my nest with her sterile, clinical words. She was turning my own mother against me. I crept up the stairs to my room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My room was my territory. The walls were covered in my own drawings of birds, detailed sketches of feather patterns and beak shapes. A pair of binoculars sat on my windowsill, pointed toward the trees in the backyard. But it didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a fishbowl. I could feel Ms. Albright's eyes on me, even through the phone line. I could hear her voice, calm and oh so reasonable, explaining to my mother that my love was a sickness. My cell phone, lying on my bed, lit up. A text from my mom. "We need to talk when I'm off the phone. Ms. Albright has suggested a specialist for us to see." A specialist. The word was a cage. They were going to put me in a room with a stranger who would nod and take notes and try to unravel the threads that tied me to my father. They would try to teach me a new language, one without whistles or coos or shrieks, a flat and colorless tongue that I would never be fluent in. They would call my grief an unhealthy attachment. They would call my joy a hyperfixation. They would medicate my memories. I looked out my window, past the familiar backyard, to the dark line of the forest on the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, the color of a starling's wing. Out there was Black Creek Trail. Out there was Arthur Finch. Out there was a world that didn't need a specialist to understand it. You just had to listen. There was no choice left to make. Staying here meant surrender. It meant letting them dissect me, label me, and file me away in a cabinet next to the one where they kept my father. I couldn't let that happen. I pulled my hiking backpack from the closet, my movements swift and silent. Water bottle, a bag of almonds, a compass, a rain jacket. I zipped it up, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. My eyes fell on the empty space on my bookshelf where my father's field guide should have been. A fresh wave of anger, sharp and clean, cut through the fear. They could keep the book. I didn't need it. I was the book. His notes were written on my heart. I scribbled a note for my mom and left it on my pillow. Needed some air. "I'm safe. I love you." It felt like a lie and the truest thing I'd ever written, all at once. I slipped out the back door, closing it softly behind me. The cool evening air was a relief. As twilight deepened, the first call of the evening began. A common nighthawk, its sharp, nasal peent cutting through the suburban quiet as it began its hunt for insects. I didn't answer it. I didn't need to. We were both just doing what we were born to do. I turned my face toward the woods and began to walk. I wouldn't stop until my feet were on the trail. The pavement under my sneakers gave way to a gravel shoulder, then to a soft bed of pine needles at the edge of the trailhead. The last street light was 100 yards behind me, a weak orange smear against the deep indigo sky. Here, the only light came from a brilliant bone-white moon. The air was different. The suburban smells of cut grass and car exhaust were gone, replaced by the damp, earthy scent of decaying leaves and the sharp, clean fragrance of pine. This was the real world. I pulled the worn straps of my backpack tighter and stepped under the canopy of trees. The darkness was immediate, but it wasn't empty. It was alive with a language I understood. The rhythmic three-part hoot of a great horned owl. Hoo, 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 floated down from a high branch, a territorial declaration. I paused, letting my eyes adjust, listening. My ears were my map. I knew this trail, but I knew the birds better. They would be my guides. I didn't search like a person would, looking for footprints or broken branches. I listened for absences. I listened for alarms. A stretch of woods that should have been trilling with the last cricket frogs of the season was silent. A patch of dense undergrowth where a whippoorwill should have been chanting its name was quiet. These were the wrong notes in the symphony, the clues that something had disturbed the forest's natural rhythm. I walked for what felt like an hour, moving deeper into the woods, following the familiar bends of the trail. The silence was starting to feel heavy, and a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp as an icicle, tried to pierce my resolve. What was I even doing? I was a kid, alone in the woods at night. Ms. Albright's voice echoed in my head. Unhealthy fixation needs a specialist. The police officer's patronizing tone. Go home, kid. Then I saw them, pinpricks of light, bobbing and weaving through the trees ahead. I heard the crackle of a radio and the low murmur of male voices. The search party. A wave of relief washed over me. These were the professionals. They would listen. I quickened my pace and stepped into the clearing they were combing. a small meadow bordered by a thick stand of hemlocks. 3 men in bright orange vests turned as I approached, their flashlight beams pinning me like a startled deer. "Whoa there," one of them said, shielding his eyes. "You're a long way from home, kid. You lost?" "No," I said, my voice coming out stronger than I expected. "I'm here to help, to find Mr. Finch." The men exchanged a look. It was the same look the police officer had given me, a mixture of annoyance and pity. "We appreciate that," the lead man said, his voice gentle but firm, the same way you'd talk to a toddler. "But this is an active search area. It's not safe for civilians, especially not at night. You need to head on home." "But I can help," I insisted, stepping forward. "I know the birds here. If something's wrong, they'll act differently. The woods are too quiet back there. The ground birds aren't making any sound. That means something big, something that doesn't belong, has been through there recently and is staying put." The man just sighed. "Listen, we've got dogs, we've got thermal imagers, we've got a grid pattern. We have a system. Bird calls aren't part of it. Now, we're going to have to escort you back to the trailhead." "No, please, just listen." "It's over, son," another man cut in, gesturing with his thumb back the way I came. "We're calling it for the night. The cold's setting in. We'll be back at dawn. You need to go. Now." He didn't mean to, but he had given me my window. They were leaving. They were giving up for the night. Their system had failed. They turned their backs on me, their conversation shifting to logistics and coffee, their flashlights already pointing back toward the parking lot. I was dismissed. Invisible again. I stood alone in the moonlit meadow, the weight of their disbelief pressing down on me. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a weird girl with a foolish, useless obsession. The cold was starting to seep into my jacket. My dad's book was locked in a drawer. My mom thought I needed a specialist. The police thought I was a nuisance. The search party thought I was a child. Every voice of authority had told me I was wrong. And then I heard it. Faint, but clear in the cold, still air. It came from the dense wall of hemlocks on the far side of the meadow. It was a single, thin, reedy note, repeated twice. ZZ. It was the feeding call of a brown creeper, a tiny insect-eating bird that spirals up tree trunks. Except it wasn't. The tone was right, but the rhythm was wrong. It was too slow, too deliberate. And brown creepers are diurnal. They don't call in the dead of night. It wasn't a bird. It was an imitation. A bad one, a human one. It was a sound of desperate, hopeful, terrified loneliness. It was someone trying to talk to a world they thought had forgotten them. My breath caught in my throat. Every doubt, every voice of authority, every ounce of shame that had been piled on top of me vanished in that single, impossible sound. The search party system had failed. The dogs and thermal imagers had failed. But my world, the world of sound they told me was a fantasy, had just provided a clue. It was a language, and someone else was trying to speak it. I didn't hesitate. I turned away from the trail the men had taken and plunged into the wall of hemlocks. The branches were dense and low, whipping at my face and snagging my jacket. The ground was uneven, a treacherous carpet of roots and rocks hidden by the deep shadows. I couldn't see, but I could hear. The memory of the sound was a compass point in my mind. I stopped, held my breath, and listened. Nothing. Just the whisper of the wind through the needles. Had I imagined it? Was this just the desperate hope of a weird girl alone in the dark? No. I couldn't afford to doubt myself now. I cupped my hands around my mouth, just as my father had taught me. I pictured the tiny, camouflaged bird, its impossibly thin beak. I let out the real call, a high, delicate, spiraling trill that was the brown creeper's true song. It was a question. Are you one of mine? I waited, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. For a few agonizing seconds, there was only silence. Then, from somewhere to my left, closer now, came the reply, ZZ. It was weak, wavering, and utterly human. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I crashed through the undergrowth toward the sound, ignoring the branches that clawed at my skin. "Hello?" I called out, my voice tight. "Mr. Finch?" A low groan answered me. I pushed aside one last thick bough, and there he was, Arthur Finch. He was slumped at the base of a large granite boulder, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. His face, which had been kind and weathered in the photo, was now pale and gaunt in the moonlight. His lips were cracked and blue. He was shivering violently, wrapped in a thin jacket that was no match for the deep night cold. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and delirium. "A bird?" he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Did I finally call one?" I knelt beside him, shrugging off my backpack. "You called me," I said, my voice shaking with a flood of emotion I couldn't name. I pulled out my water bottle and unscrewed the cap. "My name is Alara. You're Arthur Finch." He blinked slowly, trying to focus on my face. "Finch," he repeated, a faint, ironic smile touching his lips. "Named for them. Always watched them." He took a sip of the water I held for him, his hand trembling too much to hold it himself. I fell, heard the searchers. They were so close. I tried to yell, but my voice, it's gone. He coughed, a weak, rattling sound. So I tried. I tried the birds. A finch should know the birds, right? I just kept making the sounds I knew, hoped someone, anyone, would hear the wrong note. Tears pricked my eyes, hot against my cold cheeks. He heard it too. The wrong notes. He understood. It wasn't a hyperfixation. It wasn't a behavioral problem. It was a language. It was the language of the lost and of the found. Ms. Albright, the police, my mom, they were all wrong. My father and this old, dying man at my feet, they were right. It was a brown creeper, I said, my voice thick. "You were calling a brown creeper." His eyes cleared for a moment, and a look of profound understanding passed between us. He saw me. Not a weird kid, not a problem to be solved, but a fellow speaker, a translator. "You heard?" He breathed. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. I nodded, wrapping my rain jacket around his thin shoulders. He was fading, his shivering growing worse. The search party was long gone. They wouldn't be back until dawn. He didn't have that long. I stood up and looked back in the direction of the trailhead. My voice wouldn't be loud enough, but I had another voice. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold, pine-scented air. I thought of the first day in the hallway, the call that had started all of this, the sound that made everyone stare. I tilted my head back, and with all the strength in my body, I let it tear out of my throat. It was not a girl's scream. It was a high, sharp, descending shriek, a piercing cry that cut through the silence of the forest like a blade. CHRR, 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 Cree-AR. The call of a red-tailed hawk, a hunting cry that could carry for miles. It wasn't an answer anymore. It was an alarm. It was a beacon. It was proof that I was here. The shriek faded, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and the whisper of the wind. The adrenaline that had propelled me through the dark woods evaporated, leaving me cold and trembling. I looked down at Mr. Finch, at his gaunt face and blue-tinged lips, and the enormity of the situation crashed down on me. I had found him, and he was dying. The triumph of being right was a flickering candle against a hurricane of fear. I was a child, alone in the dark with a broken man, and my one hot cry felt like a tiny, futile gesture against the vast, indifferent cold. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my backpack off. I fumbled inside, my fingers numb, until they closed around the hard, cold rectangle of my phone. The screen lit up my face, a stark, artificial glare in the ancient dark of the woods. It felt like a tool from another world. I swiped it open, my thumb skittering across the glass, and dialed the 3 numbers that belonged to the world that had rejected me. A calm, professional voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? I took a breath, the cold air burning my lungs. I had to speak their language now. Not the language of birds, but the language of maps and facts. My name is Alara, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I found the missing hiker, Arthur Finch. There was a half-second of silence. Can you repeat that? I found Arthur Finch, I said again, more forcefully. I'm on the Black Creek Trail. We are approximately a quarter-mile north of the main meadow, the one by the hemlock stand. He's at the base of a large granite boulder. He's alive, but he's in bad shape. I think his leg is broken, and he's severely hypothermic. The tone on the other end of the line changed instantly. The professional calm became sharp, focused urgency. There was no disbelief, no condescension. I wasn't a weird kid anymore. I was a source of credible information. Okay, Alara, stay on the line with me. We're dispatching the team back to your location. Can you see the break in his leg? No, I stammered, looking at the twisted angle of his jeans. But it's not straight. Understood. Is he conscious? Yes, but he's confused. I knelt beside him again, putting the phone on speaker and setting it on a rock. I laid my hand on his shoulder. Mr. Finch? They're coming. The search party is coming back for you. His eyes fluttered open. He looked at me, then at the phone glowing in the dark. Wrong note, he whispered, a phantom smile on his face. You found the right one, I told him, my throat tight. Over the phone, I could hear the dispatcher talking to someone else, the crackle of a radio. Yes, she's with him now. Quarter-mile north of the meadow, near a granite formation. Confirmed visual. Then I heard it in the woods. The distant sound of men shouting. The crack of branches, much closer this time. They were running. The flashlights came first, powerful beams slicing through the hemlocks, chaotic and frantic. Hello? In here, I yelled, my voice cracking. The beams converged on my position. A moment later, the lead searcher, the man who had told me to go home that they had a system, burst through the trees. He stopped dead, his flashlight beam pinning me, kneeling beside the man they had given up on. His mouth hung open slightly. He stared from Mr. Finch's pale, shivering form to my face, and in his eyes, I saw the last vestiges of pity and annoyance get wiped away, replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. He looked at me as if he'd never truly seen me before. 2 other men rushed past him with a stretcher and a medical kit. They didn't ask me to move. They worked around me. The system, the one with its dogs and thermal imagers and grid patterns, had failed. It had turned its back and walked away. And now it was being forced to kneel in the dirt, right here in my world, guided by a sound they couldn't understand and a girl they couldn't see. The next few hours were a blur of foil blankets, hushed voices, and the blinding glare of flashlights. I remember being led back down the trail, a paramedic walking beside me, asking me questions I don't recall answering. I remember seeing Mr. Finch strapped to the stretcher, an oxygen mask on his face, his eyes closed. He looked smaller somehow, no longer a part of the forest, but a fragile object being removed from it. I remember the flashing red and blue lights at the trailhead, a chaotic, silent movie playing out before my exhausted eyes. And I remember my mother. She ran toward me, her face a mess of tears and terror and overwhelming relief. She wrapped her arms around me so tightly I could barely breathe. She didn't say anything about the note, or running away, or Ms. Albright. She just held me, her body trembling as much as mine, and murmured my name over and over again, as if it were a prayer. They took me to the hospital to get checked out, but my body wasn't the problem. The problem was in my head. I fell asleep in the car on the way home, and the nightmare began almost instantly. I was back in the woods, but the trees were skeletal, clawing at a starless sky. I could hear the ZZ call, but it was distorted, metallic, like a broken music box. I followed the sound and found the granite boulder, but Mr. Finch wasn't there. My father was. He was pale and shivering, his lips blue, and he was looking at me with Ms. Albright's flint-chip eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead of his voice, the shriek of a red-tailed hawk ripped out of him. a sound of pure agony. I woke up with a gasp, my own throat raw, my mother shaking me gently. The calls were tainted. The language that had been my sanctuary was now the architecture of my nightmares. The next morning, I sat in the kitchen, wrapped in a blanket, while my mom made tea. A northern cardinal began its bright, cheerful cheer, cheer, cheer from the backyard feeder. A week ago, I would have answered without thinking, a reflexive, joyful echo. Now I flinched. The sound wasn't beautiful, it was just noise. It was a trigger. The pure, clear notes were tangled up with the memory of Mr. Finch's rattling cough, the sight of his unnaturally bent leg, the bone-deep cold, the suffocating fear that I had been too late. My gift, the one thing that connected me to my dad, had been validated in the most brutal way possible. It had been proven real, not by a shared moment of beauty, but by a brush with death. It felt sullied. The hawk cry I had used as a beacon now felt like a scream I had stolen, a power I had no right to wield. It hadn't felt like my father's voice in my throat. It had felt like my own terror, given wings. My mom set a mug of tea in front of me, her hand resting on my shoulder. Her face was etched with a conflict I was beginning to understand. "The school called," she said softly. "Ms. Albright. She wanted to express her relief that you're safe." The word, relief, was delivered with a subtle, bitter irony. "She also said the book is in her office for you to pick up whenever you're ready." I stared into the steam rising from my mug. The book, my father's book, the thing I had been willing to defy the world for. Now, the thought of opening it, of seeing his spiky handwriting in the margins, filled me with a hollow dread. What if I couldn't hear his voice anymore? What if all I heard was the whisper of a dying man trying to imitate a bird? "Elara," my mom said, her voice gentle but firm, pulling me from the spiral. "I was wrong to listen to them. I know that." She took a deep breath. "But honey, what you did, it was incredible, and it was terrifying. You ran into the woods, at night, alone." That specialist, Ms. Albright, suggested, "I don't think it's about fixing you anymore. I think maybe it's about helping you carry this, what happened out there." She didn't understand. No one could. They saw a hero. They saw a brave kid. They didn't see that in finding Arthur Finch, I had lost something. I had lost the one place I could go to be with my father. The woods were no longer a sanctuary. They were a crime scene. The birds no longer sang. They gave testimony. My language, once a source of secret joy, now felt like a heavy, burdensome responsibility. I had proven my world was real, but the cost was that I wasn't sure I wanted to live in it anymore. The knock on the door made me jump. My mom went to answer it, and a moment later, she let a man in a police uniform into the kitchen. It was him, the officer from the station, the one with the tired face and the patronizing tone. He wasn't wearing it today. He held his hat in his hands, and his eyes, when they met mine, were filled with a discomfort that was almost an apology. "Elara," he began, his voice different, stripped of its official weariness. "I'm Officer Morrison. We met yesterday. I'm here to take your official statement about finding Mr. Finch." He glanced at my mom, then back at me. "The chief sent me personally. He wanted me to be the one to hear it." The subtext was as clear as a bell. He wanted me to be the one to face what I'd dismissed. I looked at him, at this man who was a walking, talking part of the system that had failed me. The system that told me a teacher confiscating my father's memory was just school discipline. The system that saw a child in distress and called her a nuisance. "You told me to go home," I said, my voice quiet but not shaky. "You told me to talk to my parents and follow the rules. You told me you don't get involved." Officer Morrison flinched. He looked down at the linoleum floor. "I know what I said, miss. I was wrong. I was following a procedure that didn't account for the situation. For you. A man almost died because of that procedure," I said, the words coming out colder than I intended. "I came to you for help because something that mattered was stolen from me. You told me my problem wasn't real. You sent me away, so I had to go solve a much bigger problem, alone, in the dark, because you wouldn't even help me with the small one. My mom put a hand on my shoulder, a gentle warning, but I didn't stop. I had his attention now. I had his respect, earned at a terrible price, and I was going to use it. Your system works if everyone speaks the same language. But what about the people who don't? What about the problems that don't fit in a box on your form? You didn't listen to me. You just heard a kid complaining about a teacher. You didn't hear a person telling you they were being erased. He finally looked up, and the professional mask was gone completely. He just looked like a man who had made a serious mistake. "You're right," he said, his voice raw. "I am sorry. What you did out there, we're changing how we handle juvenile reports because of you. We're implementing a new protocol. To listen first. To not make assumptions. It's not enough, I know, but it's what we're doing." It was an admission. It was accountability. It was the start of a change. It wasn't a victory, but it was something solid, a rock to stand on. I gave him my statement, the facts, the timeline, the sounds. He wrote it all down without interruption. When he was gone, I looked at my mom. "I need to get my book," I said. Ms. Albright's office was exactly the same. The scent of lavender and stale coffee, the posters of smiling, generic teenagers. She stood when my mother and I entered, her face arranged in an expression of deep, professional concern. It was a mask I could see right through now. "Ilara," she said, her voice dripping with practiced sympathy, "I am so relieved you're safe. We were all so worried." "Were you?" I asked. I walked past her and stood in front of her desk, looking at the locked top drawer. "Were you worried when you took the last thing I have of my father and locked it away? Were you worried when you called my mother and told her I was sick because I was grieving? Or were you just relieved you had a name for my problem so you could file it away?" She was taken aback. This was not in her script. "Now that's not fair. We had a plan to help you integrate. Your plan almost got me killed," I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that surprised me. I turned to face her fully. The "Find Your Flock and Fly Together" poster hung over her shoulder like a bad joke. "I found my flock, Ms. Albright. It's a flock you can't hear. I found a man who was lost and alone, and I found him because we speak the same language. The language you tried to cure me of. I didn't run to the woods to be a hero. I ran because you made my home feel like a cage and my school feel like a prison. You left me with nothing, so I had to find someone else who had nothing." My mother stepped forward, her hand on my back, a wall of silent, unshakable support. "My daughter isn't a disciplinary issue, Ms. Albright," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "She's gifted, and this school's failure to see that gift as anything other than a problem is the real issue here. You don't need to find a specialist for Ilara. You need to find a way to make this school a place that doesn't crush everything that makes a student unique." Ms. Albright stared at us, her professional composure finally cracking. She fumbled in her pocket for her keys, her hand shaking slightly. She unlocked the drawer. The click was soft, pathetic, not the world-ending thunder I remembered. She pulled out the worn, taped-up field guide and held it out. I took it. The cover was soft and familiar under my fingers, but holding it, I realized the truth. The book wasn't my father. His lessons weren't in the pages. They were in me. The book was just a map. I was the territory. "I'm starting a club," I said, looking Ms. Albright right in the eye, "a naturalist club, for bird watching, for identifying plants, for listening, for any kid who hears a different frequency. You're going to approve it, and you're going to fund it." She just stared, speechless. I didn't wait for an answer. I turned, my dad's book in my hand, and walked out of her office with my mom beside me. I didn't look back. As we stepped out of the school's heavy front doors and into the bright, clean air, a house sparrow chirped from a nearby bush, a simple, argumentative, beautiful sound. For the first time in days, I smiled. I put my lips together and, without a second thought, whistled back a perfect, clear, cheerful reply. The language was mine again. Not a ghost's, not a burden's, but mine, and I was finally ready to speak it. A month later, The world was painted in the stark, honest colors of late autumn. The air had a sharp, clean bite to it, and the trees, stripped of their leaves, revealed the intricate architecture of their branches against a pale sky. I stood at the edge of the town park with a half-dozen other kids, a mismatched flock of quiet, observant teenagers. My dad's field guide was open in my hands, but it wasn't a shield anymore. It was a textbook. "Okay, look," I said, pointing. "See the way it's hopping on the ground, kicking up the leaves with both feet? That's classic sparrow behavior. But it's got that black bib under its chin and the gray cap. That's a Harris's sparrow. It's a rare visitor this far east." A kid named Leo, who always wore a camera around his neck, zoomed in with his lens. "Whoa! You can really see it." The Harris's sparrow let out a series of clear, single-note whistles. A month ago, the sound might have sent a jolt of anxiety through me. Now, it was just information. It was a beautiful, simple fact. We stood there for a full minute, sharing the silence, just watching and listening. This was our club. Ms. Albright had approved it, her signature on the form a tight, resentful scrawl. We had a budget of $50. I'd bought 2 extra pairs of binoculars. It was the best $50 the school had ever spent. My therapist, a woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, who didn't have a single motivational poster in her office, called this reassociation. In our sessions, she'd helped me untangle the wires in my head. "The hawk cry wasn't a scream of terror you stole, Ilara," she'd said last week, her voice calm and even. "It was a tool you chose. You were the one in control. You used it to save a life. You can't let the trauma of that night poison the part of you that made the rescue possible." She was right. I had been trying to lock the calls away, just like Ms. Albright had locked away my book. I was treating my own language like a threat. But it wasn't a threat. It was a key. That's why, today, we weren't at the town park. We were standing at the Black Creek trailhead. My heart was beating a little faster, a steady thump, thump, thump like the wing beats of a grouse. The trail looked different in the bright, cold light of morning. It looked innocent. I took a breath and led my small flock under the canopy. I didn't listen for absences this time. I listened for presence. I pointed out the downy woodpecker tapping against a dead oak, the flock of juncos that flashed their white outer tail feathers as they flew, the distant, echoing caw of a crow. I was narrating the symphony, translating it for them. The woods were no longer a crime scene. They were a classroom. We eventually came to the meadow. It was smaller than I remembered, just a patch of sun-bleached grass bordered by the dark, solemn wall of hemlocks. I stopped, and the others stopped behind me. They knew this was the place. The story had been in the local paper. They didn't say anything, just gave me the space to breathe. My eyes went to the dense branches where I had disappeared. I could almost feel the phantom sting of them scraping my face. I could almost feel the bone deep cold. And then I heard it. From deep within the hemlocks, a high, thin, delicate trill spiraled into the air, the song of a brown creeper. My breath hitched. For a single, heart-stopping second, I heard the wrong note that followed it. The wavering, human ZZ. I saw Mr. Finch's pale face, his blue lips. The trauma was still there, a ghost note beneath the real song. But then I took a breath. I turned to my group. Leo had his camera half raised. A girl named Maya was staring into the trees, her brow furrowed in concentration. They were waiting for me. They were listening. "That's a brown creeper," I said, my voice quiet but perfectly steady. "He's looking for insects in the tree bark. His song is so high-pitched that a lot of people can't even hear it." I looked from their curious faces to the dark trees. It's a hard call to imitate. You'd have to be really desperate to even try. It was an acknowledgement. I was laying the ghost to rest by naming it, by putting it in its proper context. I wasn't hiding from it. I was using it to teach. Maya looked at me. Do you know it?" I thought of my father, his hands cupped around his mouth in the twilight. I thought of Arthur Finch, his eyes clearing with recognition in the moonlight. I thought of the hawk cry tearing from my throat, a beacon of my own making. My language wasn't a secret. It wasn't a burden. It was a bridge. I smiled, a real smile that reached my eyes. I brought my hands to my mouth, but I didn't make a sound. "You don't need to call back," I said, lowering them. "You just need to listen." And together, in the bright, cold air, we did. We stood and listened to the music, and for the first time, it felt like I wasn't just hearing my father's world. I was sharing it. We walked until we reached the granite boulder. It looked smaller in the daylight, just a big rock where the sun had melted away the morning frost. The hemlocks didn't seem as menacing. They were just trees. Leo took a photo of the boulder, his shutter a soft, respectful click. I ran my hand over the rough, cold stone, and this time, I didn't see my father's face. I just felt the rock. The ghost was gone. On the walk back, I felt lighter than I had in years. The woods had given me my language back, scrubbed clean of fear, and returned it as a gift I could now share. A week later, an envelope arrived. It was addressed to me in a shaky but elegant hand. Inside was a letter from Arthur Finch. He was out of the hospital, recovering at his daughter's house. He wanted to thank me properly. He wanted to meet. We met at a small cafe downtown, a place with big windows that looked out onto the town square. When he walked in, leaning on a cane, he looked exactly like the man from the poster. The kindness was back in his eyes. The weathered lines on his face were from smiling, not suffering. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was just a man. "The red-tailed hawk," he said as he sat down, his voice warm and real. "That's what the paramedics told me they heard. They said it was the only reason they turned back. They thought a hawk had found a kill. In a way, I suppose it had." I felt a blush creep up my neck, but it wasn't from shame. It was a strange, warm pride. "I'm glad they heard it," I said. "I owe you my life, Ilara," he said, his gaze direct and full of a gratitude so profound it was humbling. "But I also owe you an apology." I frowned. "An apology? For what?" "For the brown creeper," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Terrible imitation, wasn't it? I'm more of a Finch and Sparrow man myself. I was just throwing sounds at the dark, hoping one of them was wrong enough to be heard." We both laughed, and in that moment the last of the nightmare's hold on me broke. He wasn't a source of trauma. He was my partner in a secret conversation. We were the only two people on Earth who knew what it was like to speak a language of desperation in the dark and be understood. He pushed a long, flat box across the table. "For your club," he said, "for your flock." Inside was a brand new spotting scope, powerful and sleek. It was more than the school's entire annual budget for extracurriculars. It was a tangible piece of the world I saved, now investing in the world I was building. I left the cafe that day feeling a sense of quiet wholeness. The world hadn't changed. The hallways at school were still noisy. Miss Albright was still patrolling them with her hollow smile. But I had walked into the darkest place I could imagine and found not just a lost man but myself. I had learned that my language wasn't just a connection to my past, to my father. It was a connection to the present, a way to build bridges to other people. That evening, I sat in my room with the window open, the cool, crisp air filling the space. My father's field guide lay on my desk next to the user manual for the new spotting scope. From a tree across the street, a barred owl began its evening call. "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" It was the first call my father ever taught me. For a long time, hearing it only made me feel the empty space he'd left behind. But now, it sounded different. It didn't sound like a question filled with loss. It sounded like an invitation. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I finally had an answer. I wasn't the weird girl anymore. I was the girl who listens. And my flock was finally learning to listen with me. My journey started with a sound that only I could hear, and it's taken me to a place where I can finally share it. If this story, my story, has resonated with you, if it's made you feel like your own unique language is worth speaking, I'd love to know. You can tell me by hitting that like button. And if you want to see where this flock flies next, be sure to subscribe.